In the depths of winter, a young couple flees through the night carrying an infant, pursued by the threat of soldiers and driven toward Egypt by warnings they dare not ignore. The journey south becomes a brutal test of endurance as Maria and Jose traverse frozen highlands and wind-scoured deserts where temperatures plunge below freezing, where every settlement holds potential betrayal, and where the fragile life they protect becomes both their greatest vulnerability and their reason to continue. This is survival measured not in individual resilience, but in the terrible mathematics of keeping a newborn alive in conditions that challenge even the hardiest adults. A flight through landscapes that offer no mercy, guided only by desperate hope and the fierce determination that parenthood ignites when death stalks close behind. The wilderness east of the Jordan River stretches in all directions like a vast geological wound, a place where the earth itself seems to have given up on the possibility of life. Here, in the late winter months, the landscape transforms into something unexpected by those who imagine all deserts as scorching wastelands. The Judean wilderness becomes a realm of bitter cold, where nighttime temperatures plunge below freezing, and the wind carries ice crystals that sting exposed skin like needles. It is into this desolation that a man walks alone, deliberately, leaving behind the waters where he was baptized and the crowds who witnessed that moment, seeking something in the emptiness that civilization cannot provide. His name is Jesus, and he has come to this place not by accident or misfortune, but by intention, driven by something he cannot fully articulate even to himself, a compulsion to face whatever waits in the absolute absence of comfort or company. The terrain is unforgiving in its monotony. Limestone hills eroded into fantastic shapes by millennia of wind and occasional rain, wadis cutting through the landscape like scars, and a palette reduced to variations of gray and brown, and the pale blue of a sky so vast it seems to press down with physical weight. Vegetation exists only in defiant scattered patches, thorny shrubs that look more dead than alive, the occasional stunted acacia clinging to existence in a depression where water might collect once or twice a year, and dried grasses brittle as old parchment. This is a place that offers nothing freely, where survival requires constant negotiation with scarcity, and where the silence becomes so profound that a man begins to hear things that may or may not exist outside his own consciousness. Jesus carries almost nothing. A simple robe, a cloak for the nights, sandals already showing the wear of the rocky terrain. No food, no water skin beyond what he drank before entering this place. The decision to fast is deliberate, a spiritual discipline practiced by prophets and seekers throughout the history of his people. But the physical reality of it begins to assert itself within the first days. The human body, denied caloric intake, begins a sequence of metabolic adaptations. Glycogen stores in the liver and muscles are depleted within 24 hours, forcing the system to begin breaking down fat reserves for energy, producing ketones that alter brain chemistry in ways both clarifying and disorienting. By the third day, the hunger that initially gnawed at his belly with urgent insistence begins to transform into something different, a hollowness that seems to expand beyond the merely physical, creating a lightness in his head and a strange sharpening of certain perceptions while others grow dim. The cold is immediate and vicious when the sun descends, and Jesus learns quickly what desert travelers have always known, that the same lack of cloud cover that allows daytime temperatures to climb also permits nighttime heat to radiate into space with frightening efficiency. He gathers whatever combustible material he can find, dried camel dung left by passing caravans, dead wood from thorny bushes, twisted roots exposed by erosion, and builds small fires that provide more psychological comfort than actual warmth. He wraps himself in his cloak and presses against stone faces that retain some of the day's heat, creating microclimates of relative warmth in a landscape where hypothermia is as real a threat as any predator. The nights stretch with excruciating slowness, each hour marked by the wheeling of stars overhead, constellations that have guided travelers and troubled sleepers since humans first looked upward and tried to find meaning in the patterns. Water becomes an obsession by the end of the first week, a need that overrides even hunger in its urgency. Jesus moves through the wadis at dawn, searching for seeps and springs, finding occasionally a rock pool with a few inches of water, sometimes brackish and mineral-heavy but drinkable nonetheless. He learns to recognize the signs: darker stone indicating moisture, the presence of certain insects, the flight patterns of birds in the evening. The act of finding water and drinking becomes ceremonial in its intensity, each swallow a conscious acknowledgement of dependency, of the body's non-negotiable requirements, of the thin margin between life and death in such places. His lips crack and bleed in the dry air. His tongue swells slightly. His urine becomes dark and concentrated, all physiological indicators of a body under stress, managing resources with increasing desperation. But it is not the physical challenges that define this ordeal. It is something else, something harder to quantify or describe in purely material terms. Jesus begins to sense a presence in the wilderness, not constant, but recurring, appearing in moments of particular vulnerability or doubt. Whether this presence is external or internal, whether it manifests in the physical world or only in his increasingly altered consciousness, becomes a question without clear answer. He hears a voice, sometimes seeming to come from behind him, sometimes from within his own thoughts, a voice that speaks with intimate knowledge of his weaknesses and fears, that seems to understand exactly which doubts to amplify and which desires to exploit. The first temptation comes when hunger has reduced his physical strength to its lowest ebb, when the metabolic process of ketosis has been ongoing for weeks, and his body has begun the grim work of catabolizing its own muscle tissue for protein. He sits among scattered stones, thousands of them, rounded and smooth, limestone rocks weathered into shapes that in his depleted state begin to resemble loaves of bread. The voice, whether demonic presence or the desperate pleading of his own survival instinct, suggests the obvious. If he possesses the power he suspects, if he is truly what he believes himself to be, then transforming these stones into bread would be trivial, a small miracle to preserve his life and end this suffering. The logic is seductive in its simplicity. What purpose does it serve to die here alone, to waste potential on a gesture of deprivation that no one will witness or understand? Survival is not weakness, it is wisdom. Why suffer unnecessarily when relief is within reach? Jesus remains among the stones, trembling with cold and hunger and something deeper than either, wrestling with the question beneath the question. The temptation is not really about bread. It is about the terms of his mission, about whether his path will be one of using power for self-preservation and comfort, or whether there is a different way entirely, a harder way that refuses the shortcut, even when the shortcut is available and seemingly rational. He speaks aloud into the wilderness, his voice hoarse and cracked, quoting words from the ancient texts. Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. The stones remain stones, his hunger remains. But something has been decided, some internal commitment made that will shape everything that follows. The days blur together in a haze of cold nights and brutal sun, of thirst partially slaked and hunger never satisfied, of walking without clear destination through a landscape that offers no variation and therefore no sense of progress. Jesus climbs to high places, rocky outcroppings that provide vantage points over the vast emptiness, and it is in one of these elevated positions that the second confrontation occurs. The presence returns, and this time the temptation is more subtle, clothed in religious language and scriptural quotation. The voice suggests a demonstration. If God truly cares for him, if divine protection is real and not merely comforting fiction, then surely he could throw himself from this height and be preserved, held by angelic intervention, as the Psalms promise. It would be a confirmation, an end to doubt, a proof that would make faith unnecessary because knowledge would replace it. The wind howls across the plateau, and Jesus sways slightly, weakened by weeks without food. His body a collection of aches and depletions, his mind simultaneously sharp and foggy from the neurological effects of prolonged fasting. The temptation whispers through his consciousness, not the crude suggestion to test God's care, but something more insidious, the desire for certainty, for evidence that would eliminate the terrible burden of trust. Faith requires living with ambiguity, with the possibility that one might be wrong, that the convictions that give life meaning might be elaborate self-deception. How much easier it would be to know, to have dramatic confirmation that eliminates doubt and fear. But Jesus recognizes this too as a temptation, another invitation to a shortcut that would fundamentally alter the nature of his relationship to the divine and to his own mission. He answers again with ancient words, "You shall not put the Lord your God to the test." He steps back from the edge. The certainty he craves does not arrive. The ambiguity remains. Time becomes increasingly difficult to track. The succession of cold nights and harsh days blend into a continuum of endurance where consciousness itself seems to thin and waver. Jesus experiences what extreme fasters and survival situations eventually produce, altered states where the boundary between waking and dreaming grows permeable, where visions arrive with hallucinatory intensity, where the mind stripped of regular sensory input begins generating its own experiences. In one of these states, he finds himself, or perceives himself, or dreams himself, standing on a high mountain, though whether he has physically traveled or this occurs entirely in his consciousness is impossible to determine. From this vantage, he sees or envisions the kingdoms of the world laid out before him, all the centers of power and beauty and human achievement, all the glittering prizes that ambition pursues. The presence that has haunted his wilderness sojourn speaks with particular intensity now, offering what seems to be the ultimate negotiation. All of this, all the kingdoms and their glory, all the power to reshape human society and eliminate suffering and establish justice, could be his through a simple act of compromise. One moment of worship directed toward the wrong source. One acknowledgement of power through domination rather than sacrifice, and the tools to remake the world would be available. The temptation is sophisticated because it does not appeal to selfishness alone, but to the genuine desire to help, to fix what is broken, to use power for good. Surely the ends would justify such a small compromise of means? Surely results matter more than abstract purity about the source of power? Jesus, emaciated and exhausted, his body pushed to the absolute limits of what human physiology can endure without permanent damage, faces the deepest question of his mission. What kind of kingdom will he pursue, and by what methods? The voice offering immediate power and influence represents everything he could accomplish through conventional means, through the accumulation of political and military force, through the structures that humanity has always used to organize itself and pursue its goals. But he sees with the clarity that sometimes comes only through extreme deprivation that this path, however effective it might appear, would corrupt the very thing he seeks to establish. Some victories are actually defeats because they require becoming the thing you sought to oppose. He responds with finality, "Worship the Lord your God and serve only him." The vision fractures and dissolves. He is alone again in the wilderness. The kingdoms vanish like morning mist, return to the brutal simplicity of cold stone and empty sky. The 40th day arrives, though Jesus himself has lost precise count, marking time only by the rough succession of light and darkness, of thirst and partial relief, of cold and brief warming. His body has entered the stage that extreme fasting produces when all fat reserves are exhausted and protein catabolism accelerates. True starvation, where the heart muscle itself begins to be consumed, where organ function starts to falter, where death becomes imminent rather than merely possible. He lies in the shade of an overhanging rock, too weak to gather firewood or search for water, hovering in a twilight state between consciousness and unconsciousness, his breathing shallow and his heartbeat irregular. The temptations have passed, or perhaps he is simply too depleted for the presence to bother continuing its assault. He has survived 40 days without food in one of the most hostile environments imaginable, has confronted questions that have no easy answers, and has emerged with his essential commitments intact, though his body is nearly destroyed. It is in this extremity that something shifts, though exactly what occurs is difficult to articulate in purely physical terms. Later accounts will speak of angels ministering to him, of supernatural assistance arriving at the moment of greatest need, but the experience itself resists simple categorization. Perhaps it is that other humans, desert dwellers who know these wastes and recognize the signs of someone in fatal distress, find him and provide food and water. Perhaps it is that his body, having proven whatever needed proving, finally receives permission from his will to begin the process of recovery, accepting the wild plants and water sources he has been denying himself. Perhaps both explanations are true, the physical and the metaphysical so intertwined in such extreme states that separating them is impossible and ultimately pointless. What is certain is that Jesus does not die in the wilderness, though he comes terrifyingly close, and that when he eventually emerges, gaunt, weathered, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose body has been pushed beyond normal limits, he is fundamentally changed. The 40 days have burned away something inessential, have clarified commitments through the brutal simplicity of survival at its most reduced. He has learned what he can endure, has discovered that the human will, properly directed, can override biological imperatives that seem absolute, and has established the terms on which his mission will proceed, not through supernatural shortcuts or political power, or demonstrations that eliminate the need for faith, but through a harder path that respects human freedom and divine mystery, even when easier options exist. The wilderness behind him remains as it was, indifferent to his struggle, its rocks and wind and cold nights unchanged by his presence. The Judean desert will continue to challenge and kill those unprepared for its harshness, will offer its brutal education to seekers and fugitives and wanderers for centuries to come. But Jesus carries with him now an intimate knowledge of that place, has added his experience to the long history of prophets and holy men who sought truth in desolation, who believed that some wisdom only comes through deprivation, that the voice of God or conscience or deepest self can only be heard when all other noise is stripped away. The temptations he faced to use power for comfort, to demand certainty instead of living with faith, to pursue good ends through corrupt means, will recur throughout his life in different forms, the same essential questions asked in new contexts. But the wilderness has provided answers, not in the sense of eliminating struggle, but in establishing commitments that will shape every subsequent decision. He knows now in his body, not just his mind, what he can sacrifice and what he cannot, what he will do and what he will refuse, no matter the cost. The 40 days were not wasted suffering but forging, the kind of education that only extremity provides, where theories face testing and rhetoric confronts reality, and a man discovers what he actually believes when everything else is taken away. As he walks toward the inhabited lands, his steps slow but steady, Jesus embodies a paradox of weakness and strength, physically depleted almost to death, yet spiritually fortified by exactly that depletion, proven vulnerable yet made resolute through that very vulnerability. The wilderness has taught him that survival is not always the highest good, that there are things worth suffering for, and commitments worth maintaining even when breaking them would provide immediate relief. He has stared into the face of temptation, dressed in reasonable arguments and seductive logic, and has chosen the harder path not because it was easier, but because it was truer to the mission taking shape within him. The devil, whether understood as external malevolent intelligence, as the personification of internal doubt and desire, or as some combination of both, has been faced and resisted, though not destroyed or eliminated. The presence will return at other times of vulnerability, will offer other bargains and suggest other shortcuts, because temptation is not a single battle but a recurring feature of any life lived with intentionality and purpose. But the wilderness has been the decisive confrontation, the establishing of patterns and commitments that will hold through future trials. Jesus has learned that he can be hungry and not take bread, can face uncertainty and not demand proof, can see power and refuse it, and that in these refusals lies a different kind of strength than the world typically recognizes or rewards. The frozen nights and brutal days, the thirst that made thought difficult, and the hunger that made each movement an effort of will. The voice offering relief and the terrible solitude that amplified every doubt. All of it has served a purpose, has functioned as crucible for transformation. The man who emerges from the wilderness is not unchanged, but rather has become more fully himself, has shed illusions and easy certainties, and discovered what remains when everything comfortable and familiar is stripped away. He carries in his wasted frame and scarred feet and wind-burned face the evidence of his ordeal, the physical cost of spiritual education, the marks of survival not just against natural hardship, but against the more dangerous threats that wear the mask of wisdom and speak with the voice of reason while leading toward dissolution and compromise. The story of these 40 days will be told and retold, interpreted and reinterpreted, becoming a template for understanding spiritual struggle and the nature of temptation. But its core remains rooted in the brutal physicality of survival, the cold that threatens hypothermia, the thirst that produces hallucinations, the hunger that consumes muscle and organ tissue, the isolation that forces confrontation with everything usually drowned out by human company and routine distraction. Jesus has lived through something that exists at the intersection of physical ordeal and spiritual warfare, has survived the wilderness both in its geographical reality and its metaphorical dimensions, and has demonstrated that the human person, properly committed and sufficiently resolute, can endure conditions that seem designed to break body and soul simultaneously. He returns to the world of people and politics and everyday concerns, carrying knowledge purchased at terrible cost, wisdom earned through deprivation, and commitments forged in the frozen solitude of a wilderness that offered nothing but questions and the space in which to answer them honestly, regardless of the cost. Faça agora com esse título 100% inglês, A Fuga de Maria e José, sobrevivendo nas terras congeladas do Egito. Synopsis. In the depths of winter, a young couple flees through the night carrying an infant, pursued by the threat of soldiers and driven toward Egypt by warnings they dare not ignore. The journey south becomes a brutal test of endurance as Maria and José traverse frozen highlands and wind-scoured deserts where temperatures plunge below freezing, where every settlement holds potential betrayal, and where the fragile life they protect becomes both their greatest vulnerability and their reason to continue. This is survival measured not in individual resilience, but in the terrible mathematics of keeping a newborn alive in conditions that challenge even the hardiest adults. A flight through landscapes that offer no mercy, guided only by desperate hope and the fierce determination that parenthood ignites when death stalks close behind. Aguardo sua aprovação para desenvolver o roteiro completo. Okay, the night they leave. Bethlehem is moonless and bitterly cold, the kind of winter darkness that settles over the Judean hills like a physical presence, pressing down with weight and menace. Maria wraps the infant tighter against her chest, layers of cloth creating a cocoon of warmth drawn from her own body heat, while José loads their few possessions onto a borrowed donkey with hands that tremble from more than just the cold. The warning came in dreams and whispered urgency from neighbors who had heard rumors, terrible rumors of Herod's rage and his solution to the prophecy that troubled his sleep. A decree that would turn Bethlehem into a slaughterhouse, that would make every mother's arms empty and every father's house a tomb. They must go, and they must go now, before the soldiers arrive with their methodical brutality, before the thing that cannot be imagined becomes the thing that cannot be undone. The road south toward Egypt stretches more than 200 miles through terrain that shifts from rocky highlands to desert plateaus to the harsh approaches of the Sinai, a journey that in favorable conditions with proper supplies might take 2 weeks or more, but which they must attempt in winter with an infant only weeks old and resources gathered in panicked haste. José knows the reputation of this route, ancient, traveled by traders and refugees and armies throughout the centuries, but never safe, never easy, and in winter particularly treacherous. The same elevation that provides relief from summer heat becomes a gauntlet of freezing winds and night temperatures that can kill through exposure as surely as any blade. He looks at Maria, sees the exhaustion already etched in her young face from childbirth and sleepless nights, sees the way she holds the infant with fierce protectiveness, and understands that their survival will require every resource of strength and cunning and sheer stubborn refusal to surrender that they can summon. They travel by night initially, fear of pursuit overriding the practical difficulties of moving through darkness over uneven terrain. The donkey picks its way carefully along the rocky path, Maria riding when the incline permits, walking when the way grows too steep or treacherous. The infant, Jesus, though that name will carry meanings they cannot yet comprehend, nurses frequently, Maria's body providing sustenance even as her own reserves deplete, the biological miracle of lactation drawing on fat and protein stores that will leave her gaunt and weakened if she cannot find adequate food to replenish what she gives. Jose walks ahead, leading the donkey, scanning the darkness for threats both human and natural, his carpenter's hands gripping a staff that must serve as walking stick and weapon both, aware that the road harbors bandits who prey on refugees with the casual efficiency of predators, culling weak animals from a herd. The cold intensifies as they gain elevation, moving through the hill country where winter transforms the landscape into something hostile and unforgiving. Frost forms on the rocks and sparse vegetation, making footing treacherous, and their breath comes in visible clouds that dissipate into the frigid air. Maria's feet, wrapped in sandals inadequate for such conditions, grow numb, then painful, then numb again in a cycle that she knows from whispered warnings among women speaks of frostbite and permanent damage. She says nothing, adjusting her grip on the infant, checking constantly that he remains warm against her body, that his small face shows color and not the bluish tinge that would signal hypothermia. The baby is remarkably quiet, as if sensing at some instinctive level that noise means danger, his dark eyes open and alert during the nighttime travel, closing into sleep only when dawn forces them to seek shelter and rest during daylight hours. Finding shelter becomes the first survival skill they must master, not the comfortable rest of travelers with means, but the desperate concealment of fugitives who cannot afford to be seen or remembered. They avoid established caravanserais where questions would be asked and descriptions potentially given to anyone pursuing them. Instead, Jose searches for natural formations, overhanging rocks, small caves, dense thickets of thorn bushes that provide windbreak and concealment. In these marginal spaces, they huddle together, sharing body heat, the donkey positioned to block wind, creating microclimates of relative warmth in a landscape where nighttime temperatures regularly drop below freezing. Maria nurses the infant while Jose keeps watch, his eyes scanning the approaches to their hiding place, knowing that discovery could mean death, not through violence alone but through being driven back onto the road without adequate rest, the cumulative exhaustion eventually proving as fatal as any sword. Water is abundant in the early stages of their journey. Winter rains have filled cisterns and created temporary pools, but food becomes immediately problematic. The supplies they grabbed in their hasty departure are meager: some bread, dried figs, a small amount of cheese. Jose rations carefully, giving Maria the larger portions because she is feeding two, taking for himself barely enough to maintain strength for walking and the constant vigilance that survival requires. He forages as they travel, identifying edible plants with the knowledge common to people who live close to the land, wild greens that can be eaten raw, roots that can be dug and chewed for their starch, berries still clinging to winter-stripped bushes. The meals are never adequate, never satisfying, but they provide enough calories to keep moving. To maintain the body temperature that means the difference between life and death in the freezing nights. The threat of pursuit haunts every decision, every moment of rest cutting into the distance they should be covering, every fire they dare not light for fear of revealing their position. Jose has no way of knowing if Herod's soldiers are actually following them specifically, or if the mass slaughter that was prophesied has created such chaos that individual families fleeing south would not warrant organized pursuit. But he cannot afford to assume safety, cannot risk the lives under his protection on optimistic guesses. So they maintain the grueling pace, travel by night despite the dangers and difficulties, hide during daylight, despite the exhaustion that makes every waking moment a battle against the desire to simply stop, to rest properly, to sleep without the constant vigilance that turns rest into another form of work. By the end of the first week, they have covered perhaps 60 miles, leaving the familiar territory of Judea behind and entering the approaches to the Negev, where the landscape begins its transformation from rocky highlands to the desert proper. Here, the winter cold manifests differently, less the damp chill of elevated regions and more the fierce temperature swings of arid lands where the absence of moisture and cloud cover allows heat to radiate away into space with frightening efficiency. Days can be almost pleasant, the sun providing genuine warmth, but the nights become exercises in survival, temperatures plunging so dramatically that Jose and Maria must wrap themselves together with the infant between them, using the donkey's body as windbreak and every scrap of cloth they possess as insulation, creating a nest of shared warmth that barely holds against the cold that seeks to invade and extinguish. The infant develops a cough during the second week, a sound that sends terror through Maria's heart because she has seen how quickly children can sicken and die, how the robust health of morning can become the funeral of evening when infection or exposure takes hold. She keeps him against her skin constantly now, not just for feeding but for the warmth and the monitoring that allows her to detect any worsening of his condition. She prays, not the formal prayers of synagogue, but the desperate internal bargaining of a mother who would trade anything, suffer anything, to preserve the small life dependent entirely on her. Jose watches her face, sees the fear she tries to hide, and increases his foraging efforts, searching for anything that might provide better nutrition, finding wild honey in a rock crevice and bringing it back like treasure, watching as Maria takes small amounts for energy, the sugar providing brief respite from the constant depletion. They encounter other travelers periodically, traders moving in small caravans for mutual protection, other refugees fleeing various threats and seeking in Egypt what they cannot find in Judea, Bedouin shepherds moving through their traditional ranges with herds of goats and sheep. Each encounter requires rapid assessment, threat or opportunity, danger or potential assistance. Jose has learned to read faces and postures, to distinguish between those who might share resources or information and those who view refugees as prey. Once, they receive genuine kindness, a trader who shares bread and asks no questions, seeing in Maria's exhausted face and the infant's small form something that moves him to generosity. More often, they are met with suspicion or indifference. Other travelers too focused on their own survival to spare resources for strangers whose stories might or might not be true. The descent into the true desert begins in the third week, elevation dropping and vegetation becoming increasingly sparse, the landscape reducing itself to essential elements of stone and sand and the vast empty sky. Here, the survival skills shift from managing cold and finding shelter to the eternal preoccupation of desert existence, water. The cisterns and pools that marked their earlier journey become less frequent, and Jose must plan their route around known wells and springs, forced now to take more traveled paths despite the exposure this creates, because attempting to cross waterless stretches with an infant would be suicide. At each water source, they rest longer than prudence suggests, allowing Maria to drink deeply, knowing that her hydration directly affects her ability to nurse, that the infant's survival depends on the chain of resources flowing from water to mother to child. The donkey, faithful and uncomplaining through the weeks of hard travel, begins to show signs of exhaustion, its pace slowing, its head hanging lower, the ribs showing more prominently through its hide. Jose knows that if the animal fails, their situation becomes exponentially more desperate, that Maria cannot walk the remaining distance while carrying the infant and their supplies. He becomes fanatical about finding forage for the donkey, leading it to whatever dry grasses or thorn bushes exist, allowing it longer rest periods, rationing his own food further so that he might occasionally offer the animal some of their grain, turning bread into fuel for the beast whose continued function means their survival. Bandits find them on a narrow section of the path where rocks crowd close on both sides. 3 men appearing from concealment with the casual confidence of predators who have done this many times before. They want the donkey primarily, also whatever food or valuables the refugees might possess, and they show the cold calculation of men who have learned that violence is simply another tool, neither good nor evil but merely efficient. José positions himself between the bandits and Maria, his staff held in hands that have grown hard and capable through weeks of travel, his body language communicating a willingness to fight that gives the bandits pause. It is not that José appears likely to win such a confrontation. He is one exhausted man against 3 rested and experienced thieves, but rather that he clearly will not surrender without cost, that taking what they want will require effort and risk injury. The standoff stretches, tension vibrating in the cold air, until one of the bandits notices the infant, sees something in that small wrapped form that reaches through the calculus of violence and touches something else, some memory or vestige of conscience. They withdraw, not through defeat but through choice, melting back into the rocks and leaving the refugees to continue their flight. José's hands shaking with released adrenaline and the knowledge of how close they came to disaster. The border into Egypt is not a line, but a transition, a gradual shift in the character of settlements and the languages heard in marketplaces, the architecture of buildings, and the protocols of commerce. They enter during the 4th week, having covered ground that should have taken longer but which desperation and fear have compressed through sheer relentless forward motion. Egypt means relative safety from Herod's reach, means the possibility of stopping, of resting properly, of beginning to think beyond the next mile and the next water source. But it also means being foreigners, refugees without resources or connections in a land that has absorbed countless such displaced people throughout its long history, a land that can be haven or trap depending on fortune and the kindness of strangers. They find shelter in a community of Jewish expatriates in a small settlement near the Delta, people who recognize in this young family with their infant and their obvious exhaustion a story familiar from their own histories, or their parents' stories, the eternal narrative of flight and survival that runs through their people's experience like a recurring theme. A widow offers them a corner of her dwelling, asking no rent, providing food from her own limited supplies, moved by Maria's youth and the infant's vulnerability. Here, finally, they can rest without the constant vigilance, can sleep through entire nights without waking to scan for threats, can begin the slow process of recovery from the physical and emotional depletion of their journey. The infant's cough gradually subsides with rest and regular feeding, Maria's milk production stabilizing now that she can eat adequately and is not under the constant stress of travel. José finds work using his carpenter skills, his hands remembering the familiar motions, even as his body slowly rebuilds strength, depleted by weeks of insufficient food and relentless physical demand. They do not speak much about what they fled, about the massacre they escaped, about the other infants who did not survive Herod's paranoia. The weight of that knowledge sits heavy between them, a grief for children they never knew, but whose deaths purchased their son's survival through the accident of timing and the warning that sent them fleeing into the night. The winter deepens and then gradually releases its grip, the cycle of seasons continuing regardless of human suffering or survival. The sun's path shifting with astronomical precision that cares nothing for the refugees who huddle in borrowed shelters, or the soldiers who commit atrocities, or the kings who issue the orders that set such events in motion. Maria watches her son grow, hitting the small milestones that mark infant development, his eyes tracking movement with increasing focus, his hands beginning to grasp objects deliberately, his small body adding weight and strength. Each day he survives feels like victory, like justification for the terrible journey, like evidence that their flight was not cowardice but the proper response to genuine threat. José lies awake sometimes in the darkness of their small room, listening to Maria's breathing and the infant's small sounds, processing the transformation that the journey has worked in him. He left Bethlehem as a carpenter, a tradesman of modest skill and limited ambition, responsible only for his new family in the normal ways that men are responsible. The flight has revealed capacities he did not know he possessed, the ability to continue beyond exhaustion, to make rapid decisions under pressure, to navigate threats, both human and environmental, to protect what he loves through whatever means necessary. But it has also shown him his profound vulnerability, how little control he actually has, how dependent their survival was on factors beyond his capability to manage, the weather holding just barely tolerable, the bandits choosing mercy over violence, the widow offering shelter when she might have turned away strangers. He is both stronger and more aware of his weakness than before, humbled and emboldened simultaneously by what they have endured. The months in Egypt stretch into a year, then longer, time marked by the infant's development and the rhythms of their adopted community rather than by dramatic events. They hear news from travelers and traders about Herod's death, about the succession struggles among his sons, about the gradual possibility that return might be safe. But they do not rush back, having learned caution through brutal education, understanding that timing matters and that safety is never guaranteed, only estimated with varying degrees of confidence. They wait until the signs seem more certain, until the political situation stabilizes, until Jose receives in dreams or intuition or simple accumulated information the sense that the time has come to return. The journey back will be easier in some ways. They are no longer fleeing in panic, no longer pursued by immediate threat, traveling in warmer seasons and with better preparation. But in other ways, it carries its own difficulties. They are returning to a land marked by trauma, to a town where every family of young children will have lost someone, where their survival will be both blessing and complicated burden, evidence of grace that highlights the absence of grace for others. Maria carries this knowledge with the same fierce protectiveness she carries her son, understanding that his survival comes with responsibilities they cannot yet fully comprehend, that the flight and the return are part of a larger story whose full meaning remains hidden in the unknowable future. The frozen nights of their flight, the desperate hiding in caves and thickets, the gnawing hunger and the constant fear, and the terrible vulnerability of protecting an infant through conditions that challenge even adults. All of it becomes part of the foundation of who they are, who they will become, and who the child they protected will eventually reveal himself to be. The journey has taught them that survival is never guaranteed, that providence works through human effort and circumstance in ways that leave room for both gratitude and sorrow, that protecting what you love sometimes means risking everything in flight toward uncertain refuge, trusting that the road will provide what is needed even when all evidence suggests otherwise. When they finally do return, crossing back into Judea with the son who survived when so many did not, they carry with them the knowledge that safety is temporary, that peace is always provisional, that the world contains both terrible cruelty and unexpected kindness, and that the small life they protected through frozen highlands and desert nights and the charity of strangers will grow into something they can only partly imagine, fulfilling purposes that justified the flight, but which will demand sacrifices they cannot yet foresee. The journey to Egypt and back becomes the first chapter in a larger story, the initial test of endurance that prepares them for everything that follows. The brutal education in survival that teaches Maria and Jose what they can endure, what they will sacrifice, and what they will protect regardless of the cost. Lessons written in the cold nights and hungry days and the desperate mathematics of keeping a fragile life burning against winds that sought to extinguish it before it could illuminate anything beyond its own brief existence.